Hi, everyone. My name is Tyler, and you may know me from the Jams and Tea podcast as the T in that podcast's titular acronym. Today, I'm here with a solo video to do a tier list ranking of a band that means an awful lot to me. An incredibly important band, an incredibly influential band on my musical taste, my musical development. And I think a band that probably tells you a lot about the sorts of things that I value in music. But they're also a band that I don't feel we've had a lot of opportunities to talk about on the podcast. For our ongoing Record Club series, I had the five of us review their album English Settlement. We did that about a year ago, one of our earlier Record Club episodes. I'll put a link to that video in the description if you want to check it out. We had a really interesting conversation about that album. But anyway, for those of you who maybe don't know, who might not be huge XTC experts, I'm hoping to gear this video so that it can be enjoyed by both hardcore XTC fans like myself and also people who might be completely new to XTC, totally unfamiliar with what they have done musically over the years, and who are perhaps maybe looking for some advice on where to start or how to get into their dense and varied discography. So if that's you, if you're not super familiar with XTC and you're hoping to get some pointers on how to get into them, I'm hopefully going to be able to do that for you today with my discussions of these records. There's definitely great points to get into their discography, and it really depends on what your musical interests are, because XTC are so varied and they're so much more than a basic pop band. I mean, at the end of the day, that's how they kind of boil themselves down, is pop music through and through. But that ranges from post-punk to baroque pop and all kinds of various, unique and idiosyncratic variations on XTC's very singular definition of pop music. So we'll dig into that, and I'm sure there might be some disagreements from hardcore XTC fans as to certain placements on this list. So I want to emphasize from the off that this tier list ranking, whether I put an album in the S tier, the A tier, the B tier, the C tier, or the D tier, is not me saying that by that is the rating I would give the album. It's me rating these albums relative to each other. Okay, so a D tier XTC album might still be better than most bands' entire discographies. You know what I mean? So it's not me saying that if I put an album in the D tier that this record is terrible. I don't think any XTC albums are bad. It's just me saying that relative to the other records in this discography, I'm going to make some hard calls to see how they spread out. And look, this is purely for fun. I want to emphasize that as well. I don't take this seriously in the slightest. I am doing this as an XTC fan, as a way to have fun, and I hope you take it as the fun exercise that it's intended as. And I'd love to hear from you, XTC fans out there, if you disagree with me and how you would arrange these records differently, if at all. So, brief overview of XTC. XTC were, of course, a British, English specifically, rock band originating from Swindon, came together in the early 70s. And the sort of two linchpins of XTC throughout the decades have been Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding, the two primary songwriters. Andy Partridge being the real kind of driving force of the two in particular, but the dynamic between Andy and Colin is quite important to what XTC is, what the XTC sound is as well, even if Andy does get the lion's share of the attention and the lion's share of the songwriting credits. But of course, XTC are not just those two. They've had various members throughout the years as well. The sort of third core member of XTC is the drummer, Terry Chambers, and also we can't forget as well guitarist Dave Gregory, neither of whom have been in the band the entire time they were a band, but both of whom had invaluable contributions during the times in which they were members, particularly Dave Gregory, whose guitar work in some of XTC's later records is particularly, and not even just guitar work, multi-instrumentalist, virtuosic work is absolutely crucial to the sound of basically every record that he features on. So yeah, I'm going to hopefully be able to give shout outs to each member of XTC's contributions along the way. Anyway, enough talk. Let's jump straight into this ranking. And we'll start, of course, with their very first album, 1978's White Music. So their very first record, let me just highlight it here, produced by John Leckie, who is a production engineer, collaborator who would come to work with XTC a number of times, as we'll see. And it's a really sort of solid debut. It's definitely rough around the edges. It's definitely rudimentary. And it's definitely inconsistent. It doesn't have a lot of classic XTC songs, though it does have some that are quite important to the story of the band. The real sort of three major tracks of note here are Radios in Motion, which is a great sort of like real throttling, post-punky, vervy banger. This is Pop, which is not a great song, but certainly like an important one in terms of the mission statement of the band, in terms of like declaring that, the crazy sort of noise that these, rambunctious Swindon kids were making was intended to be pop music, was intended to be taken as pop music, even if they infused a lot of weird, avant-garde, unusual sounds into it. So This Is Pop was a really important song for that reason. And of course, Statue of Liberty is a really sort of great, funny and cheeky single. There are other interesting moments on this record too. There's a Bob Dylan cover of All Along the Watchtower, which is quite an interesting experiment. I think it's the furthest afield from anything resembling conventionality that this record goes. And also Neon Shuffle is a decent closer as well. But I will say that I think much of the rest of this record is middling and overly silly. It's definitely the sound of a band that hadn't quite found their sound entirely yet. It is scrappy. It's really only interesting and worth checking out if you're already an established fan of the band. I would say don't start here if you're curious about who XTC are and what they sound like. They would develop in strides from this point. And particularly the songwriting as well is just not really there yet. I would say Colin's songs in particular are unfortunately quite weak, and he doesn't really lock into anything interesting on this record like he would in future XTC records. And so for all these reasons, White Music goes into the D tier relative to the other records in this discography. However, XTC were catching on to some heat. They actually released 2 albums in 1978. Their sophomore effort, Go To, also came out that year. Really interesting cover that doesn't really show up very well. I think it's by Hypnosis, worth checking out for this record. But it's also produced by John Leckie, and it's kind of an even more frustrating album than White Music because it's even less consistent than their debut, but it does have some really good highs. Mechanic Dancing is immediately catchy as hell in the same way that Statue of Liberty was. It has some great vocal harmonies and acrobatics from Andy that are beginning to feel more exciting and natural than even what they were on White Music. Battery Brides is interesting too. It's almost for the opposite reasons as Mechanic Dancing. It's kind of an Eno imitation that builds into this swirling creation that feels very much like Andy and the band are beginning to really explore more out there sounds in kind of confronting ways. And this, at this point in their sort of early era, also has to be at least partly attributed to the contributions of Barry Andrews, who is fairly essential in this early phase, even if he would obviously leave the band fairly shortly afterwards. His short tenure with XTC does tend to get forgotten, and the frictions that he produced in the band as he wrestled with Partridge to have more input on the record's writing are definitely audible. The 2 tracks that he has a writing credit on are handily the worst ones on this album, those being My Weapon and Super Tough. But he slots in beautifully to the fabric of other tracks, like Colin's eerie Buzz City Talking, which I'm quite fond of. The A side of this record finishes great with the gritty noise and vocal runs of Andy's track Red, an easy standout. And B side opener Beattown is great too and sees the band really leaning into their psychedelic tendencies with an Abbey Road-esque outro that absolutely kills and really benefits from Leckie's masterful work behind the boards. So the highlights here are really, really strong. But it has to be said that the rest of this record, particularly the rest of the B side of this record, is either painfully mediocre or just not fully formed. Those aforementioned Barry tracks are dreadful, and Partridge sounds stilted and tuneless on songs like Life is Good in the Greenhouse, which is a total slog, unfortunately for me. The reissue of this album puts Are You Receiving Me in as the closer, which gives the album a much needed jolt of life at the end, but not enough to really save the fact that this one starts strong, but just kind of collapses under a lack of clear focus and cohesion within the band. You have to wonder whether things would have been different if Brian Eno had produced the album like the XTC guys originally wanted him to. It's an interesting thought. So while part of me wants to really ride for Go-To as an underrated record, especially because of those highs, I just can't get past the really half-baked stuff that really bogs this album down. So for that reason, I have to put Go-To in the D tier as well. I'm going to put it above White Music though, because it is a slightly more interesting album than that one. But yeah, still firmly in the D tier. And I would say both of these first two records, if you're not familiar with XTC, skip these. You can come back to them if you want to get a fuller picture of the band's early sound. But at this point, they hadn't quite found it yet. However, that was all about to change immediately, thanks to, well, two men in part, Hugh Padgham and Steve Lillywhite. And thanks to them, on their third album, 1979's Drums and Wires, XTC have a fuller and richer sound than ever. The spaciousness of their gated reverb approach, epitomizing how the band have blossomed into their fullest form on this album. Part of that has to, of course, be attributed to the replacement of keyboardist Barry Andrews with guitarist Dave Gregory, who helped the band to achieve a bigger, more intricate sound and would be utterly indispensable, really, from here on out. However, beyond just the assuredness of the sound of Drums and Wires, the songwriting here also reaches the consistent greatness that eluded the first two records. Finally, everything all kind of slots into place in a way that it just wasn't up to this point. And this kicks off with Colin's most enduring song, Making Plans for Nigel. Ultimately, this is probably the greatest XTC song, full stop. Certainly one of the most well-known, one of the most enduring, one of the most attention-grabbing. This was the first XTC song I ever heard as a kid, and will always have an incredible close place in my heart for that reason. It's just a sensational single, and it just rip-roaringly throws you into this new album and new sound for XTC. And though the sound is fuller on this record, to be sure, the band have not lost any of the angular guitar work and post-punk sound that characterized the first two albums. It's just more dynamic and layered on Drums and Wires. Every song is bursting with creative ideas and hooks. Andy gives an insane vocal run on the stunning Helicopter. The superb Roads Girdle the Globe is a slow burn with a stunning pulse and a sound that brings the album title to life. Reel by Reel has one of their most iconic guitar line hooks of the whole discography. Outside World is an underrated deep cut that builds to a frenzied climax. And Scissor Man is just weird in the funkiest way possible. All absolutely stellar songs, and other show-stopping moments include tracks where also the structure is less conventional and more about building tension in a way that actually reminds me quite a lot of my other kind of favorite band of this late 70s post-punk era, which is Wire. I'm particularly reminded of Wire on songs like Day In, Day Out and Complicated Game. With the latter track in particular, which is the closing track of the record, being a straight terrifying piece of music and probably their greatest album closer ever, in my opinion. There's no other XTC album. I mean, they have a lot of great closers, but there's no other XTC album that ends with the kind of ceremonious fire of Complicated Game. It is really something you have to hear to believe. if you're new to XTC and if you're looking for a friendly place to begin, then Drums and Wires is absolutely one of the records I would recommend. It was the first XTC record I heard. I don't think it's quite as consistently flooring as some of their later albums, which I think just keeps it from being an S tier XTC record, but it's still an iconic and important album that begins a sequence of peerless creative peaks. So gonna chuck that one right firmly into the A tier. A great, great album. However, they were not at their peak yet. And they're a band moving incredibly fast at this point as well. With 1980s Black Sea, you get a moment where XTC goes from being a great post-punk band to a fantastic pop band. That blossoming angular sound with its unique percussive heaviness and vocal idiosyncrasy that you were really properly introduced to on Drums and Wires reaches new heights on Black Sea, which in most respects isn't that much different from Drums and Wires, except for that the songwriting goes from mostly excellent to unwaveringly fantastic, with not a single track on this album being remotely inessential, in my opinion. Opener, Respectable Street, displays everything exciting about the band at this time, alongside some of Andy's most acerbic but witty and vivid lyricism, which comes into fuller focus here than it ever had before. Colin has only 2 songs on Black Sea, but both are standouts, with the catchy whistle tune of the punchy generals and majors and the radiant Love at First Sight being perfect examples of how purely lush this album can be in spite of its metallic, colder production style. Living Through Another Cuba is the classic song on an album full of contenders, in my opinion, an absolute top 3 XTC track, a song I could happily keep on repeat indefinitely, a slap happy Cold War jam that has this energetic work song feel to it, these amazing vocal harmonies, and an irresistible guitar line. Terry's cymbal fills on Burning with Optimism's Flames are fucking tasty. And that hook on this track is so undeniable too. Underrated deep cuts on Black Sea include Rocket from a Bottle's throttling boom, No Language in Our Lungs, slower groove with a stunning Dave Gregory solo. Just every song is a winner. The band's established trick of finishing with a weird one continues here with one of their most esoteric and avant-garde songs in the closing track, Travels in Nihilon, where Terry's machine-like drumming takes full precedence in an almost tribal fashion as Andy gives a straight, bizarre vocal performance that sounds as though he's summoning a demon. It's a lengthy 7 minutes for such a simple and repetitive setup, but the end result is both eerie and hypnotic. Overall, Black Sea is a masterpiece, the first of many masterpieces for XTC, and one of the most essential new wave records. Regardless of how familiar you are with new wave, post-punk, or XTC, Black Sea should absolutely go high on your listen list if you haven't heard it already. This is undeniably an S tier record. So at this point, XTC have been moving at a kind of frenetic pace, basically an album nearly every year. And so their next record is 1982's English Settlement, which has a little bit of a longer gestation period and is a little bit of a, not a left turn for the band, but a developing of their sound in a way where it starts to feel like you're getting a really clear picture of XTC's identity, of how multifaceted XTC's identity is. Because you've started out with this real kind of sharp post-punk sound in the early days. It's blossomed into this very pop-influenced sound. And then you've gone through pop music on Black Sea into a kind of different sound. It's hardly a pivot away from new wave or post-punk, but it is a decisive shift into a more dynamic and lush direction that is often described as pastoral. The band sort of channeling and leaning into the influence of folk music, of English, sort of classical English music, and the psychedelic rock music of the UK in the 60s, which is something that will feed into a number of later XTC related projects as we'll get into. But English Settlement is really one of the band's most adventurous and exciting and uncompromising albums. It is a double album. It is over 70 minutes of music, 15 tracks, and that encroaching influence of folk music, that encroaching influence of kind of pastoral, softer timbres, really accentuates the sound of Andy and Colin's songwriting on this record. It opens with the absolutely swirling and stunning Runaways, a great Colin track that almost feels like you're beginning the album in medias res, like you're beginning the album in the middle of something, in the middle of some kind of long, winding journey that it pulls you through. You actually get two Colin tracks in a row with Ball and Chain coming afterwards. And this is another fantastic song. Just great, sharp guitar work, but also these really lush keys. I think they're played on a mini Korg, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but it's this really warm sound that reminds me of, like, you know, Mike Oldfield and Genesis and prog music a little bit that comes into this track. And it's a beautiful example of the dynamics of the music on this record, the differences and juxtaposition of that kind of really harsher sound and the lusher textures that XTC were getting more and more interested in exploring on this record. Of course, you have the classic single Senses Working Overtime, one of their most enduring songs, a great Andy track, catchy as hell. You have moments on this record as well where XTC really take advantage of the double album format, of the sweeping tone of this record, to really kind of create some more expansive compositions. Songs like Jason and the Argonauts, songs like Melt the Guns, songs like Leisure, which are more moderate in pace. All of a sudden it's too late as well. More moderate in pace, kind of content to sort of swirl and be almost hypnotic in a certain way, and not necessarily feeling the need to throttle you with a kind of fast-paced, catchy rhythm. They're still catchy songs, but they're more detailed and intricate, and they show the growing sort of influence of XTC's kind of sort of studio obsession with kind of creating these dense and heavily mixed tracks that are just brimming with detail and flourishes. I mean, I'm particularly fond of Melt the Guns. I think it's this really just great, catchy track that has this awesome sort of jittery acoustic breakdown and these kinds of radiant keys that come in through it, and it's awesome. Leisure, I think, is a really underrated track as well. All of a Sudden It's Too Late is one of Andy's finest ballads that he's ever written. A very moving and emotional song. You also get tracks like No Thugs in Our House as well, which are kind of booming and loud and huge. That kind of opening scream that Andy brings into that song is so charismatic. And you also get really sharp writing continuing on this record too. This song is a really kind of acerbic track about a sort of middle class or upper class family where the parents are wistfully unaware that their son is essentially a neo-Nazi. And it's great. It's fantastic. It's exciting songwriting. The last two sides of this kind of double album are perhaps less immediately gripping than the first two sides, but there's some real gems here as well. I love Colin's just bizarre and just zany Fly on the Wall, which is one of the most far out XTC tracks, I think. Really super enjoyable. And then the record finishes really strongly as well with Snowman, which almost leaves you out in a way that feels as though the album's coming full circle and the album isn't really finishing, but kind of wandering off unfinished. And it gives this album this kind of freewheeling feel that I could understand being not necessarily for everyone, but I absolutely love it. English Settlement is a masterpiece. I think it's an even better and more exciting record than Black Sea, especially for all of the variation that it gives. And I utterly recommend it. It's probably not the best entry point into XTC just because of how eclectic and long and dense it is. But once you've found a couple of XTC records you like, then I would say English Settlement is pretty indispensable and you should definitely give it a chance. But this was the point at which things changed quite dramatically for XTC following a huge sort of meltdown, which I guess is not a very generous way of phrasing it. But essentially, Andy had had enough of performing live. His prescription pill addiction, as well to Valium, had sort of he'd gone cold turkey off of Valium, and it had put him in this kind of real detoxed and just entirely refreshed state of mind, where he basically made the decision that he did not want to tour again with XTC. This led to some real creative frictions. Terry Chambers left during the creation of their next record, but ultimately it also led to an unfortunate situation with regard to XTC's public perception too, especially because their label Virgin were not really doing them any favors in this regard. And so you get their next record, 1984's Mummer, is a really sort of forgotten album in a lot of senses. It feels like it's been getting a bit of a resurgence in recent times, but generally it's still less of a well-regarded and less of a well-liked record, and more sort of overlooked, I think, than certainly the records that precede it. And these creative tensions, the departure of Terry, the lack of success of a lot of the singles on this record, the general sound alienating a lot of their potential audience, especially with regard to the fact that Mummer is an album where XTC recede further into that pastoral folk sound. They shed a lot of the harder edges of English Settlement and lean really heavily into the sound of tracks like Yacht Dance, which is another absolute favorite of mine from English Settlement that I forgot to shout out. And so the result is an album that is not quite as exciting as English Settlement is. It's much more reserved in tone, but it has its own unique joys and pleasures. I'm particularly enamored with the first sort of opening stretch of this record. I think it starts really, really strong with Beating of Heart sort of bringing you into this world of kind of trilling, pretty guitar tones and really kind of playful, booming percussive lines. It's just really, really awesome. Wonderland is a great Colin track, really sort of esoteric and strange and awesome textures. It's quite low key in a way that I definitely think contributed to sort of people being turned off by this record. But a song like Wonderland is so joyful and pretty and lush to me. There's a lot going on with this seemingly straightforward instrumental that I really enjoy on this album. You get the record's usually widely agreed standout, Love on a Farm Boy's Wages, is a stellar song too. Even if you don't listen to Mummer, this is absolutely a song you should listen to. Andy's lyricism here is evocative and sweet and gentle in a way that I really love when Andy gets like this. He doesn't often get this purely, uncomplicatedly sentimental, or not even sentimental, but just kind of like emotive without being sentimental, emotive without being saccharine. It's this gentle tale, and it's beautiful. Deliver Us from the Elements is an underrated Colin track, in my opinion. Again, it's on the stranger side. It's a little more avant-garde. It's a little sort of murkier and weirder, but I really dig it. However, it has to be said that Mummer's weaknesses, again, lie in its inconsistency with regard to the B-side. There's some good bonus tracks that have been added to later editions of this record, sandwiched in the middle. I'm not going to mention those, but I will say that I'm not as enamored with the second half of this record as I am with the first. Human Alchemy, in particular, I think is one of the band's weakest songs. It's a real plodding slog. It's very misguided, in my opinion. Doesn't belong on the record. Loving Memory of a Name and Me in the Wind are decent tracks. Definitely good songs, but also don't really ignite like anything on the first half. Ladybird, however, is a really great deep cut, a beautifully soft and just wonderful song from Andy that I really enjoy. So overall, I'm kind of mixed on Mummer. I dig it a reasonable amount. I think that first 5 tracks in particular are really strong and interesting, and I think it's definitely widely underrated. Its brevity as well, if you don't count the bonus tracks, which I don't, in my opinion, I don't think they should have been sandwiched, and even though some of them are good, but its brevity with only sort of 10 songs is definitely an asset in this instance. And so for all of these reasons, I'm placing Mummer quite comfortably in the B tier. I definitely think it's an underrated XTC record, but I just can't say I'm quite fully in love with it the way I want to be, just for those reasons that I've specified. Which means, again, XTC, despite the fact that XTC have receded and are no longer a live band, they're purely a studio band, Steely Dan style, they still keep producing music at a reasonably prolific rate. And the very next year, you get The Big Express, which is an interesting album. In many ways, I think Andy has spoken of it as kind of like a counterpoint to Mummer. It's kind of like Mummer and Big Express are these two sides, two very different sides of the same sort of coin of English, of modern sort of English life, basically, with Mummer being this kind of pastoral countryside record, and The Big Express being this much more kind of jagged record representing urban England and cityscapes and the industrial clang of modern Britain. And so The Big Express, I think, for entirely different reasons to Mummer, but also kind of at the core quite similar ones, is equally underrated. I think it has similar issues of inconsistency as well, but it can't be expressed enough what a hugely different record this is from Mummer. It makes a heavy use of a drum machine to really kind of evoke that industrial clang. It's a very sort of sterile sounding album, very kind of heavy in terms of that percussion and in terms of that studio sound. Many, I think, have criticized this record for sounding sort of overly noisy and kind of abrasive in terms of how it's mixed. I mean, they're not terribly dense tracks, but for the most part, but they are mixed in this very aggressive and loud way that I can see being a turnoff. For me, the mixing is not really an issue. I think it works, and it works to accentuate a lot of the best moments of this record, like that opening track, Wake Up, as well, which kind of just rattles into your headphones as soon as it comes on. It's a great, fantastic opener with a lot of energy. I also want to give a shout out to a song which is, I think, generally underrated, except within the XTC fan base and within Andy himself, who considers it one of his best songs, Seagulls Screaming Kiss Her, Kiss Her, which is an easy song to overlook, I think, because it is this song that lingers in dissonant tones in a really kind of affronting way. It's in many ways one of the kind of core demonstrative tracks for the sound of this record, but I love the sense of anxiety in the song underpinning this narrative of wanting to kiss this girl who would go on to be Andy's wife. Everyday Story of Small Town is fantastic too. I love the real sort of shuffling drums and vocal runs of this track. A Rain of Blows is an underrated deep cut as well. And Train Running Low on Soul Coal is an absolutely ballistic closer that ends this album in the most chaotic way possible, especially with, you have moments on this song where Andy is straight doing like train noises, and it's kind of scary, but it's really entertaining as well. There are other moments on this record that I find less interesting. Again, much like with Mummer, I think this is a front-loaded record, and some tracks on the back half, like Liar Bird and You're the Wish You Are I Had and I Remember the Sun, are not bad songs, but they don't leave as much of an impression, and they don't feel as well written as the highlights here either. So that's kind of the place I'm in with The Big Express. It's a record that has similar strengths and weaknesses as Mummer, even if it's the polar opposite in terms of sound. But I do think that Mummer's general sound is more inviting and warm and interesting than The Big Express, which I think has a few more weak spots than Mummer. So for that reason, I'm going to put The Big Express in the C tier. Again, that I don't think it's a C-rated album. I just think it's a C-rated XTC album. However, basically, XTC were in dire straits at this point in their career. Commercially, both Mummer and especially The Big Express had really just flopped. No singles had really had very much traction at all. And so Virgin, in one of the few sort of good decisions they ever really made with XTC, encouraged the band to hire an American producer to tone back the Englishness of their music, which, is kind of an offensive thing to say, but also at the same time, XTC were at a certain point where, especially with Andy's kind of laser focused and very sort of cluttered interests in terms of musical arrangements, needed a fresh approach to invigorate themselves and remind audiences how great the sound of their records could be, above and beyond the songwriting, which is always great anyway. And so Skylarking comes next in 1986, generally regarded as XTC's masterpiece. And you know what? I cannot disagree in the slightest. Skylarking is a phenomenal record. It is an absolute journey from front to back, and the production work and hands-on approach of Todd Rundgren in structuring this album and sort of helping the band to realize a concept that was unifying these songs, a season cycle, as one of the tracks directly references, makes this one of the most satisfying XTC album experiences from front to back. And just generally, the quality of the songwriting is fucking peerless. It opens with a stellar combo of Summer's Cauldron and Grass, which are frankly inseparable because of that transition. But generally, the entire A side of this record feels like its own sort of continuous suite of music. That's Really Super. Supergirl is just like one of the band's best straight pop songs, a great effort from Andy, incredibly catchy. 1000 Umbrellas is this great sort of, it's a simple sort of core, sort of acoustic, mopey ballad from Andy, but it's given so much weight by Dave Gregory's string arrangements, which add a lot of character and hugeness to the song and totally transform it into a total album highlight. And unlike the previous two records as well, this is not a front-loaded album, even if the pleasures of the back half of Skylarking are somewhat more reticent and sort of low-key. The songs themselves are still absolutely great and reveal themselves to you the more and more time you spend with this record in a way that the previous two albums don't. Also, the inclusion of Dear God as well on subsequent issues of the album, particularly when it is placed prior to Dying on this album, is an absolutely great choice. I mean, it's obviously one of their most enduring and classic and memorable singles, and really holds up as a phenomenal song to this day. At this point as well, I have to shout out in particular the remasters of this album, but also several other XTC albums by Steven Wilson. If you're checking out any of these albums, records like Drums and Wires and Black Sea, I'm pretty sure he's done, and definitely Skylarking, and I think he also did Oranges and Lemons and Nonsuch. If you're checking out any of those records, absolutely look for the Steven Wilson remaster versions of them, because those are the records at their best sounding. His remasters are totally essential and add a lot of vibrancy to the mixes. Which is not to say that any of these records are mixed flatly, but Steven Wilson's surround mixes particularly bring out the vibrancy of a record like Skylarking in particular, which I think is one of his greatest remix works. An absolutely essential thing to check out if you get into this album. I don't have a single hot take about this record. It has endured in my memory across the many, many times I've heard it. It gets better with age. It is a record for any season. It is a record for any mood, and it is an absolute triumph for XTC, and it is their masterpiece, and it absolutely goes right to the front of the S tier and right to the front of the XTC ranking. So at this point, I want to talk about a couple of unusual projects for XTC that saw the band indulging in their interests in classical English psychedelic rock music from the 1960s. And that was when the band basically created a new band specifically for this purpose. And that band is called the Dukes of Stratosphere. And XTC fans will know exactly what I'm talking about. The Dukes of Stratosphere was a fictional band that was invented in order to give XTC, to give Andy and Colin and Dave specifically, an excuse to indulge their fascination with psych rock from the late 60s, their interests in bands like the Moles and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. Obviously, bands like the Beatles are bands that have influenced XTC's other records in very, obvious and clear ways. But the Dukes of Stratosphere projects, the two albums that were released under the name Dukes of Stratosphere, are really where they indulge this interest to its fullest extent. The first of these came out in 1985, actually before Skylarking. And the idea was it was presented as a lost album. They asked Virgin to present this as a lost record from the late 60s and to present the Dukes of Stratosphear as an actual legitimate 1960s psych rock band. And I don't think, or psych pop band, I should say, and I don't think that that charade successfully lasted very long. But 25 O'Clock, which is the first of these two records, is, in my opinion, the more successful of the two. It's a shorter album. It's only 25 minutes long. It feels very much more like a suite of 6 songs that kind of flow together as this one singular experience. And it is absolutely transfixing. It's indulgent, lush, and pretty, and enjoyable, and compelling, and layers. It gives them, again, another outlet to focus on layering instrumentation together and creating these swirling psychedelic effects and really taking them to their fullest hilt. 25 O'Clock is a really beguiling record in particular, and even though it's short, it does not feel unsubstantive at all. It absolutely comes together beautifully, and even though it's not quite, shall we say, a top tier XTC related project, it still has a lot of really enjoyable highs, and it's just a really transfixing and fun experience. And for that reason, 25 O'Clock is going in the B tier ahead of Mummer. And the second album that XTC released as Dukes of Stratosphear, the second and final record, called Psonic Psunspot, came out in 87, so a year after Skylarking, and saw the band embracing a kind of fuller sound for the Dukes, going a little bit further in that direction, exploring with a little more variation in terms of what the Dukes could sound like. And weirdly enough, it kind of shoots itself in the foot a little bit, because it starts to sound less like the Dukes of Stratosphear and more like just XTC exploring a new avenue of their sound. And in trying to mold it into this Dukes of Stratosphear vibe, the end result is something that's less consistent, less compelling, and less unique than 25 O'Clock. But that's not to say that there aren't any great songs on it. I think Colin's track Vanishing Girl, which opens the record, is great. Little Lighthouse is a really awesome track, which I'm pretty sure originated as an XTC B-side. And my favorite song on Psonic Sunspot is Kaleidoscope, which ends the A-side in a really sort of like great place. It's a fantastically entertaining and lush song that feels very quintessential Dukes of Stratosphear in terms of really nailing the sound that XTC were trying to go for with this project. However, again, it's another front-loaded thing, because the B-side of Psonic Sunspot is just not as strong. Some real sort of comparatively undercooked tracks like Shiny Cage, The Affiliated, You Are My Drug. These are not bad songs. Let me be clear. They're really good songs. They're just not up to snuff, really, with some of the other stuff on this record. I like Brainiac's Dilder a fair bit, and Pale and Precious is actually a really nice closer. It's a little more stripped back and quite beautiful, actually. I really enjoy it. So there is an end result, I think, is that Psonic Sunspot is interesting continuation and further exploration of the Duke sound, but also feels like you can hear the band sort of losing interest a little bit, or sort of reaching the limits of what they could do with this persona. And so as a result, it's not one of the more successful XTC related projects, in my opinion. Psonic Sunspot, which I'm glad I'm never going to have to say out loud again, is now going in the C tier below Big Express, unfortunately. But anyway, enough of that sidetrack. Back to XTC. In 1989, you get Oranges and Lemons, which is the follow-up to ostensibly the follow-up to Skylarking for XTC, and it is the sound of a band absolutely reinvigorated by their experience writing and recording Skylarking. It's also, in some respects, easy to read as a reaction on Andy's part, or maybe on the whole band's part, to the process of Skylarking, because while Skylarking was this very lush, ornate, and beautifully balanced album, Oranges and Lemons is hard as hell. It is full bore XTC pop at its most aggressive and thrilling and colorful. I mean, that album cover, which, as you can see in miniature here, is so just all over the shop and zany and nuts that it immediately lets you know that you're in for an XTC that sounds wilder and crazier than ever in the best way possible, because I think this record is outstanding. It is not a top tier XTC record, but it is a really great album that I think has become a little bit underappreciated, which is weird to say because it has some of their most enduring and well-known singles on it. Songs like Mayor of Simpleton, most people who are vaguely familiar with sort of 80s pop music and 80s UK pop music probably know this song, even if they don't know XTC. King for a Day as well is great. Garden of Earthly Delights, they form a fantastic trilogy of music that opens this record. And there are tons of deep cut highlights on this album too that feel like they've gone underappreciated to a large extent. From what I've heard, I never really see songs like Poor Skeleton Steps Out, songs like the fantastic One of the Millions, songs like the just superb Across This Ant Heap, and the great closer Chalk Hills and Children. I don't see enough people talking about how fantastic these songs are. Perhaps I'm just not engaging in the right circles. That said, one way in which Oranges and Lemons does feel limited is in the sense that there are certain moments where it feels very much like let's throw everything at the wall and let's just make this rambunctious, huge album that is ultimately longer than it needs to be. It's over an hour long and 15 tracks. And there are just some songs that don't really need to be here. I'm not terribly enamored with Here Comes President Kill Again, which is one of Andy's less nuanced and or interesting political commentaries, social commentaries, and Scarecrow People as well has some clunky lyricism, although I think that I find that song so instrumentally engaging that I'm willing to overlook that. But then there are other moments on the record that just don't really leave much of an impression, like Hold Me My Daddy, or the kind of misguided Pink thing, which is one of multiple Dick songs in the XTC catalog that I'm universally just not particularly fond of. Miniature Sun feels like filler as well, I hate to say. So ultimately, while this is a pretty good XTC record, it is far from a great one. It has some absolutely essential songs on it that need to be heard, and it is still underrated in spite of all of this. So I give this album a decent and well-earned spot in the B tier, and I'm going to put it, where should I put it? I'm going to put it below 25 o'clock, but ahead of Mummer, I think is a really fair place for Oranges and Lemons. Really definitely recommend listening to this record if you like XTC. It shouldn't be your intro. Again, your intro, you're going to be better off with Drums and Wires, Black Sea, or Skylarking as your intro, and one other record, which I'll get to. But Oranges and Lemons still absolutely deserves your time, and it's still a really fun album in spite of some flaws. And then you go into, I believe, their last sort of major studio release with Virgin, 1992's Nonsuch, which is this album here. Now, I have levied some criticisms at Oranges and Lemons that the record is too long, that the record has too many tracks, that the record has filler tracks. And all of those criticisms, unfortunately, also apply to Nonsuch, which is even longer by a couple of minutes and has 17 songs on it. However, I would also like to counter that by saying that Nonsuch is an even better album than Oranges and Lemons on the whole, and succeeds by and large where that record doesn't quite hit the mark, because Nonsuch is loaded with some of XTC's best songs. The opening track, Ballad of Peter Pumpkinhead, is just enormous and booming. It has this great harmonica line in it that's instantly memorable. Great vocal melodies as well. It'll get in your head. It opens the record beautifully. One of the most underrated songs of XTC's whole career, in my opinion, is Colin's stellar My Bird Performs, which is the second song on this album. And I've listened to the song a million times. I can't point out a single aspect of this song that I don't think is absolutely perfect. The vocal harmonies here, the bass line, the beautiful horn lines, everything about this song is utterly intoxicating. Dear Madam Barnum is fantastic too. Humble Daisy. The Disappointed is a really underrated track as well. And then you get these kind of stark standouts that happen as the record goes on that really kind of are arresting in their beauty and austerity. Songs like Rook, which is this absolutely devastating song about mortality that has these great sort of very jazzy and slow and moving pianos that erupt into this Philip Glass-esque sort of arpeggiating melody at certain points in the song. It is breathtaking. Then She Appeared is stunning also. And of course you have deep cut fan favorite. Everyone knows that Wrapped in Grey is one of the best songs Andy's ever written. It is an absolute top 5 XTC song, essential listening, utterly moving and emotional and beautiful. And Books Are Burning is a great closer too. Even if there are undeniably filler songs on this record, Bungalow leaves very little impression. War Dance is kind of misguided in my opinion. Omnibus I have a weird sort of soft spot for, even if it's a little bit, some of the lyrics on this track are a little bit not quite not quite there, let's just say. And Smartest Monkeys again, like Kill Again on the last record, it's kind of a blunt metaphor on this track, but I don't mind it. Holly Up on Poppy's kind of mid, but look, it's a really good album overall. In fact, it's one of those weird albums where the strengths of the high points and the just general sweep of the way the album flows is kind of makes up for any of the weaker moments. And there's certainly nothing on this record that remotely approaches bad either. So even in spite of how weirdly conflicted I am on certain aspects of album structuring on some XTC records, this is a record that is very well balanced, is neither front nor back loaded, staggers its highlights beautifully, and is very easy to listen to from start to finish, despite being 63, 64 minutes long. And for that reason, Nonsuch gets a handy place in the A tier, just below Drums and Wires. Now, we have a lengthy gap in XTC's studio album discography. Nonsuch came out in 1992, and it's another 7 years before we get the next XTC record, which is the Apple Venus duology. 2 albums that were released 1 year apart and intended to be a part of a sort of singular whole. Or again, it's like with Mummer. I see it as very similar to the Mummer Big Express situation, where these are 2 quite distinct records that sound very different from each other, but are kind of these 2 sides of the same sort of coin in terms of the lyrical themes, interests, and just generally where Alan and Colin and Dave were at as musicians at this particular point in the XTC progression. And so I'm going to start this discussion by talking about the second of the 2 records. And the reason for that is that I don't want to end this video on a bum note. And I do think that the second volume of the Apple Venus duology, which is titled Wasp Star, is unfortunately handily the worst XTC album. And I'm very curious to hear from XTC fans on what you think of my take here. I'm sure it's not particularly uncommon, but I have spent extra time with this record this week in preparing for this video to try and see if it would grow on me. And if anything, I enjoy Wasp Star less and less with time. It is a weirdly dissonant album. Whereas Apple Venus, the first volume that I will talk about in a minute, has this kind of beautiful, lush sound to it that complements these very sort of like pastoral again and beautiful and simple and natural lyricism. Wasp Star focuses around this kind of stark contrast between that sort of playful, naturalistic, and summary lyricism that I've talked about, and this really weird, grungy, dark, distorted guitar tone that characterizes many of these songs. A key sort of example is the track Stupidly Happy from Colin, which is basically a ripoff of Third Eye Blind's Never Let You Go. It still executes the record sound well. I think it's one of the better songs here. It layers in twinkling guitars and bass to build hypnotic and lush loops, even with this grimy backdrop. Though it does sort of just trail off at the end, and ends really unceremoniously, as though Colin couldn't really be bothered finishing the song. It's a real shame. Opening track Playground is a similarly sweet opener in terms of tone, has that same sort of biting, distorted guitar backdrop. I think it's a bit more successful than Stupidly Happy. It's one of the highlights of the album, I think. I quite enjoy the schoolyard chants of playground, playground in the background. They come off as charming rather than grating. And as a duo, these two tracks, Playground and Stupidly Happy, represent a curious but unified distinction from the more palatable Volume 1, which I'll get to in a minute. Some of these tracks are just clearly more fully written than others, and occasionally the densely constructed walls of studio sound make the songs feel damp and weighed down rather than fresh and invigorating. Many of these tracks will orient themselves around a steady riff and beat, and they'll just go nowhere with it. Very little interesting variation is introduced within most of the songs on Wasp Star. It's just more layering that comes irritatingly in and out of focus across many of the tracks here. A lot of these songs have good or at least acceptable musical foundations, but so they're never really unpleasant to listen to, but they're so uninspired relative to the project's first volume. And that's just ignoring the songs that are outright bad on this album. My Brown Guitar, much like Pink Thing from Oranges and Lemons, is another unforgivably wooden and unfunny dick song from Andy. I mean, it's almost insulting to compare it to Pink Thing, because that is a much more lyrically interesting song, even if song is limited and not particularly interesting to me. There's still a lot more going on lyrically there, whereas Brown Guitar is just, it's lazy. It never takes off. It is an easy career low light, and I hate listening to it, frankly. Similar feelings, honestly, for the song Wounded Horse, which has an unbearably deflated vocal from Andy. It's clearly a blues pastiche, but it just does not fit Andy's style at all. And I look, bless him for trying. I really appreciate the continuous attempt to do something new with a record like Wasp Star, but it never gets off the ground. However, all of that said and done, I can give unequivocal praise to The Wheel and the Maypole, which is an absolutely perfect closer that blesses the album and ties a neat bow around this ambitious final era of XTC. The booming guitars here sound genuinely lively and exciting. The arrangement and Andy are equally lively and animated, and the 6-minute runtime is well utilized and suitably sweeping. Ultimately, when I reflect on Wasp Star, I'm reminded a little bit of REM's Monster, which is an album I like considerably more than Wasp Star, but represents a similar kind of just dramatic pivot away from a lusher sound when you compare Wasp Star to Apple Venus, much as you compare Monster to Automatic for the People. And it just doesn't feel fully fleshed out on Wasp Star. However, the flip side, Volume 1 of Apple Venus. The reason why I've talked about the Apple Venus and Wasp Star albums in reverse order is I really want to finish on Apple Venus. And the reason for this is that I think Apple Venus is one of the greatest albums ever made. It is absolutely incredible. It is basically flawless. There's one song on this record that I think doesn't quite hit the heights of the others, which is Colin's curious and, endearing, but ultimately insubstantial Fruit Nut. But that aside, every other song on this record is a 10 out of 10. Every single one. It does not miss the mark. Even the more subtle and quieter moments like Nights in Shining Karma are utterly show-stopping. And the huger moments with these lush, gorgeous, ornate, and very intricate string arrangements, songs like Easter Theater, songs like I'd Like That, songs like Harvest Festival, songs like Green Man, basically every other song on this record is absolutely unbelievable. I can't I can't lavish enough hyperbole on Apple Venus to truly get across how resplendent this album is. And if you listen to any XTC record post Skylarking, make it Apple Venus Volume 1. It is utterly essential. It's not on streaming services, which is really unfortunate. But you can listen to it on YouTube. And if YouTube isn't good enough for you, get in touch with me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is in the description, and I can help you to listen to the record as it should be heard. But yeah, this is an absolutely astonishing record. I can't give it enough due. Easter Theatre is my favorite XTC song, just absolutely hands down. Even over Making Plans for Nigel, which is maybe their most classic. I absolutely adore Easter Theatre. River of Orchids opens the album in this very beautifully minimal place that with these kind of water dropping sounds that turn into string parts that eventually kind of blossom together into this huge introduction to the record. I'd like that as just simply the best romantic ballad that XTC have ever written by far, and a totally beguiling and transfixing song. Your Dictionary is one of the great breakup ballads, great angry breakup songs I've ever heard, really. Andy's writing here is creative, funny, and lacerating. And if you've ever been through a particularly painful breakup or experienced a particularly painful betrayal, this song will hit deep. It's a fantastic track. Green Man is this amazing centerpiece that is probably the largest, lushest, and most enormous sounding XTC song ever. The first time I heard it, I was kind of just gobsmacked that this band had produced it. It's cinematic in all the best ways possible. And then this record ends in absolutely heart-stopping fashion with the emotional closer, The Last Balloon, which is this. I mean, if Apple Venus is an album that is kind of obsessed with celebrating the kind of natural beauty and the embracing of the natural beauty of the earth and of the kind of pastoral rural landscapes of England bleeding into the urban landscapes and kind of transforming these concrete jungles into amazing replenished landscapes, then The Last Balloon is a kind of heartbreaking farewell to all of that. And it's just Apple Venus Volume 1 is an utterly indispensable record and reminds me at every turn how beautiful XTC can be and how amazing their music is. And so I'm going to place Apple Venus and Wasp Star in my ranking together. Wasp Star, unfortunately, my least favorite XTC record, goes handily at the bottom of the D tier. And Apple Venus is depending on what day of the week you ask me, I could just as easily tell you this is my favorite XTC record, or as I could tell you that Skylarking is my favorite XTC record. But I mean, the more I reflect on it, the more I can't deny how amazing Apple Venus truly is. It is a stellar and beautiful way for the band to end their career, and it absolutely takes my breath away. And for all of those reasons, I'm deciding right here, right now, on the fly, to put Apple Venus at the very top of the S tier and say that I think that Volume 1 is the XTC's finest hour. But it's close. It's really close with Skylarking, and those two are totally interchangeable, which of course highlights how ridiculous this whole ranking exercise is. But it's just for fun. And it's fun to have an excuse to talk about all of these albums, even if I've undeniably spent far too much time doing that. So there we have it. The XTC discography, every single album ranked from worst to best and assigned to its relative and appropriate tier. I should emphasize that with the exception of Wasp Star, all of these records are either good or great or spectacular. So don't be put off from checking out any of these C or D tier records if you find yourself really enjoying XTC and curious about these lesser talked about or lesser appreciated albums. There's still gems to be found on all of them. I mean, even Wasp Star has Wheel in the Maypole, that amazing closing track. So ultimately, the reason I wanted to do this tier list is that I think XTC has one of the greatest discographies in all of pop music. And every album deserves to have its moment in the sun and its moment of appreciation. So yeah, that's what I think. But anyway, let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this video? What do you think of my ranking? What do you think of what I had to say about these albums? Would you rank these differently? What would be in your own personal top tier XTC list? You can throw a whole discography ranking in the comments if you want to. I really want to hear from all the XTC fans out there what you think of this discography, what your favorites are, and what you think of my opinions, basically. Yeah, as I said earlier as well, our group review of English Settlement is in the description box below, so check that out as well. And yeah, that's basically all there is to say. Rock over London, rock on Chicago. What do you call that noise? This is pop.